If you were the king, what would you do? If you had the privilege, the power, the prerogative to do as you please, if you had the authority to act, if you had the power, what would you do? From another angle, what would you not do? What kind of tasks, chores, duties would you say, forget it, I'm not going to do that anymore? What would you delegate? What would you dish out? What would you just be done with? What kind of dirty work would you wash your hands of forever? Kind of a fun question, right? If not also a revealing one, an interesting one. Those kinds of fantasies of power, they kind of come natural to us, don't they? Once in a while, we indulge the imagination, we invent all sorts of satisfying scenarios. Think of the weary wage worker. Maybe she imagines, boy, if I had the power, if I had the authority, if I was in charge, if I were in charge, well, I'd tell my boss just how I feel about him. I'd throw the uniform down on the counter, and then I'd leave with a dramatic flair. Young man might think this. Boy, if I were in charge, if I had the power, boy, I would soak it up, I would bask in it. The acclaim, the accolades, the approval, I'd love it. Take advantage of all the perks and the privileges and the position. What would you do if you had the power? You know, that's this world's idea of the good life, right? The perks, the position, the status, the privileges. This world's idea of the good life, the blessed life, is one where slowly we serve others a little bit less. We're at the bidding, the call of others a little bit less, and others begin to serve us a little bit more and more. That's the idea, right? That's the fantasy. That's what we imagine. But tonight, Jesus, as he speaks to his disciples just hours before his arrest, his crucifixion, his death, he teaches them one last lesson. A lesson about love and service and humility. Jesus teaches on his hands and knees what it means to love one another as he has loved us. Sermon tonight is taken from John chapter 13. Here Jesus' disciples, they're gathering for the Passover feast. And we're not many hours away from the very hinge of history where all of it would turn. All of world history has culminated in this one moment. Old Testament history is building up to this moment. The Passover feast, the crucifixion, the resurrection, all of it is building up. Jesus himself has predicted this, all for this hour that Jesus talks about so much in John's Gospel. The hour of suffering, the hour of crucifixion, the hour of glorification. It's all building up. And you would think that the disciples, they might catch on to it, that they might sense this. Jesus himself has predicted his death, but they don't. You might expect a heightened sense of reverence from them. You might expect them to set aside the petty concerns, the earthly pursuits for just a minute, but they don't. The other gospel writers tell us that what were they talking about this night? Who was the greatest among them? Arguing about who was better, who deserved more, who ranked higher up on the rankings of the disciples. It's a little stunning in hindsight, right? You look back at history and you kind of think, how can anyone be so self-absorbed? How can anybody be so engrossed in their own status while they're about to watch the very passion of the Christ? But lest we fall into the very same trap of the disciples, lest we reflect on this text and think, we are greater than the disciples, well, we ourselves might ask a couple of questions. If Jesus were to come into this church, right, if he were to, in the flesh, be here, physically, locally, if he were to roll up his sleeves, is there anything that he might do that might embarrass us? See, he grabs the vacuum before we get a chance. Well, maybe we would balk at using the vacuum or picking up the crumbs or taking out the trash. If he would do that, how would we feel? We'd feel a little embarrassed, right? A little bit like those disciples must have felt as Jesus picked up the basin of water and started to wash. Is there something that our Lord might do if he fills in all the blanks on the volunteer sheets? Is there something that he might do that we, at least momentarily, might not be willing to do that would leave us maybe a little bit ashamed? might ask ourselves as we reflect on what the disciples did, or rather didn't do that night, is there some kind of service that you or I, that we might think we're exempt from? That because, not of aptitude, but of attitude, we simply think that something is beneath us. We might ask when it comes to church, what is it that I expect on the news? You hear all sorts of stories about pastors fleecing their flocks, taking advantage of the people. And it's kind of taken for granted that if you're looking for a church, well, the church ought to pitch to you, right? They ought to talk about what kinds of not only needs, but also wants they can fill for you. What kind of consumer desires they can fill in your heart. The question asked so often is not what can you do for your church, but what can your church do for you? And not even talking about spiritual needs, but consumer comforts. Might also, as we're reflecting on the disciples, ask, how do I regard others? What kind of interactions do I have with others? Are they marked by gridlock, by grudges, by tension, or by humility? By gently approaching a brother or a sister, by humbly saying, maybe I was wrong. Might ask how we regard ourselves. Surely I can't be the only one. You have a couple of sacrifices, you spend some time, some energy and service to the Lord, and little thoughts of entitlement, they come unbidden into your mind, and they start to get you to think that maybe you deserve a little bit more, a little bit better, that maybe someone else can do that kind of work, because you deserve more. Ultimately, it comes down to two visions of the good life, right? Two ideas about the Christian life. Did God give me this life purely for my own pleasure, my own self-fulfillment? Is the summit, the apex, the climax of my life to have others serving me, to have others adoring and honoring me, or is it just the opposite? Is there a joy in serving? Is it a privilege to honor and to serve others? Is the Christian life oriented not toward self, but is it angled toward God and neighbor? In John 13, we see the latter. I'll read it again. You can hardly match the poeticness of it. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. For a moment, it almost stings a little bit. There's a little bit of indictment as the disciples must have reflected in stunned silence at what the Lord did that they didn't do. And perhaps for a moment we feel indicted at what we haven't done, what the Lord has done for us that we haven't done for others. But you know, the Lord didn't do this to shame us. He didn't do it out of spite. He didn't do it to leave us feeling guilty. Rather, he did this out of love and service to teach us this lesson. See, more than that, we also see the love, the humility of Christ. And do you hear all the build-up to that message? Do you hear all those little things that John is piling up? The reason why Jesus did this. It says Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. Jesus knew that God had put all things under his power, knew that his death was going to come. So what does he do? Knowing that he would be given the name that is above every name, the name at which every knee should bow, knowing all of that, knowing that he is King of the universe, what does all of that mean? Because Jesus is King, if he were King because he is King, what did Jesus do? Does he send down a blast of holy wrath and condemnation upon Judas? Does he ditch the disciples before they could ditch him? Does he leave them? Does he enjoy the perks and the privilege, the position that he has as King of the universe? No. Takes off his outer garment, pours water into a bowl, and then he comes to the disciples. Perhaps you might envision it this way. People in that day and age, they would have reclined, leaned on an arm, perhaps with their feet radiating outwards from the table. And so if there's someone walking around the periphery, you could probably very well ignore the servant who is washing feet. But you really couldn't ignore it when Jesus did it. Simon Peter, in fact, says, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet. Right? This is a stunning display. You can look through all of ancient history. Commentators have tried it, and they have not found a single kind of demonstration of a servant heart like Jesus. Someone who would perform such menial service to his followers. Peter can't believe it. Lord, you're not going to do this. This is completely out of line. You're not going to do this for us, the disciples? And so they have an exchange. Peter and Jesus, they go back and forth. 1 minute, Peter's saying no, and the next he's saying, well, now you got to wash all of me. You got to wash me head to toe. Boy, you can sympathize with him, right? Sometimes we probably don't get what God is saying about authority, what he's saying about love, what he's saying about service, but then in the next, when we get it, when he tells us a little bit more, when he talks about having to be washed, boy, we say with Peter, so often, don't we? Lord, you're going to have to wash all of me. Not just the feet. No, you're saying that if I want to part with you, you got to wash me, and get the pressure washer, get the scrub brush, get the soap, get the lye, get all of it. Well, Jesus insists on two things here. First, he says, I will serve. He says, I'm going to serve. He would do that. He would do that for his disciples. He loved them to the end. He loved them to the nth degree. He would serve them by acting as the despised servant, not only there, but he would serve them by acting as the despised servant on the cross as well. Jesus also insisted on this. He says, Peter, you already are clean. For all those days that you feel unworthy or unclean like Peter, for all those days that you're thinking, Lord, you got to wash me again. You got to do a whole lot more to wash me. Jesus says you are clean. You already are cleansed. You don't need another bath. You don't need another shower. All of the sins, all of the failures, all of the attitudes, all of the arrogance, the pride and the preference, all of that, it's all washed away. You are clean. Well, eventually, Jesus, he finishes washing the feet. He puts his robe back on. And he sits down, he takes his place as teacher once again, and he interprets what he's just done. Do you understand what I've just done for you? And he frames it in terms of love. He says, if the master does this, if this is not beneath the master, then surely it's not beneath the student either. He says, a new command I give you, love one another. This concept of love, it's not new, but the way that Jesus talks about it is new. This is a new community, a new era. The way that Jesus loved, this was new. So what might that look like for you and for me? To love one another as Jesus has loved us. I suppose we could probably spend here all night talking about what it means to love one another in vocations, in the household, in society, with our neighbors, but maybe St. Augustine said it best, love and do as you will. Being loved by Jesus, we trade the fantasies of power for the fascination with service. The Lord sets us free to love creatively, to love all sorts of people in all different ways. The question used to be, the fantasy used to be, if I were king, what would I do? Now the question has changed. The king has come. The king has become the servant, and he is served. So how do you want to serve?